On a cold, grey January morning in 1649, a man stepped onto a wooden scaffold in the heart of London, surrounded by a sea of grim, silent faces. This man wasn't a criminal or a traitor in the conventional sense. He wasn't an unknown rebel or a figure whose name would fade into history. He was King Charles I, ruler of England, Scotland and Ireland. And in mere moments, he would become the first and only English monarch to be executed by his own people. How does a king, a man believed to rule by divine right, end up kneeling at the block? The story of Charles I's execution is one of ambition, rebellion, betrayal, and an unyielding belief in the sanctity of power. It's a tale that begins decades earlier, in a time when the throne of England was both a symbol of unity and a lightning rod for conflict. Charles was not born to wear the crown. He was a second son, quiet and unassuming, overshadowed by his elder brother Henry, who was expected to inherit the throne. But fate intervened when Henry died unexpectedly in 1612, leaving the young Charles as heir apparent. In 1625, Charles ascended to the throne following the death of his father, James I. By then, England was a fractured kingdom, torn by religious strife, economic instability, and a growing rift between the monarchy and Parliament. Charles inherited his father's belief in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were chosen by God and accountable only to him. But Charles was no diplomat. Where his father had been cunning and pragmatic, Charles was rigid and stubborn, deeply convinced of his own righteousness. This conviction would be both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. From the beginning, Charles's reign was marked by controversy. His marriage to a French Catholic princess, Henrietta Maria, caused widespread unease in a predominantly Protestant country. His insistence on imposing Anglican practices across his kingdoms alienated Puritans and Presbyterians alike. But it was his relationship with Parliament that proved most disastrous. In 1629, after a series of heated disputes over finances and royal prerogatives, Charles dissolved Parliament and began what became known as the personal rule. For 11 years, he governed without calling Parliament, raising money through controversial taxes and fees. To many, it seemed as though Charles was setting himself above the law, ruling more like an autocrat than a constitutional monarch. By 1640, the king's policies had driven England to the brink of chaos. A rebellion in Scotland forced Charles to recall Parliament for financial aid, but the members he summoned were no longer willing to be his rubber stamp. Instead, they sought to curtail his powers, igniting a bitter power struggle that spiraled into the English Civil War. For nearly a decade, England was consumed by bloodshed and turmoil. On one side were the royalists, loyal to Charles and the monarchy. On the other were the parliamentarians led by Oliver Cromwell, who fought for a government free from royal overreach. The war tore families apart, devastated towns, and left a trail of destruction across the countryside. In 1646, Charles surrendered to the Scots, hoping to exploit divisions among his enemies. But his attempts to negotiate a return to power only deepened the mistrust against him. When he secretly conspired with the Scots to launch a second civil war, Parliament decided that enough was enough. In January 1649, Charles was put on trial for treason. The trial itself was unprecedented. Never before had a reigning monarch been held accountable by his own subjects. Charles, ever the believer in his divine right, refused to recognize the court's legitimacy. The verdict was inevitable. Charles was found guilty and sentenced to death, but even then the decision to execute him was met with profound unease. Yet the parliamentarians believed they were acting in the name of the people, asserting that no man, not even a king, was above the law. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, Charles walked to the scaffold at Whitehall. He wore 2 shirts, fearing that the cold might make him shiver and be mistaken for fear. Before laying his head on the block, he addressed the crowd, maintaining his innocence and affirming his belief in monarchy. When the executioner's axe fell, it wasn't just the head of a monarch that was severed, it was the very idea of absolute royal power. For a moment, England became a republic, led by Oliver Cromwell and the parliamentarian forces. But the republic was short-lived. By 1660, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, Charles I's son, who reclaimed his father's throne with a mixture of pragmatism and caution. Yet the legacy of Charles I's execution endures. It was a watershed moment, a reminder that power is not unassailable, that even kings can be held accountable. It set a precedent for challenging authority and reshaped the balance of power between rulers and the ruled. The scaffold at Whitehall may be long gone, but its shadow lingers. Charles I's death wasn't just the end of a reign, it was the beginning of a new chapter in the story of democracy, a chapter written in blood and sacrifice. Thank you for exploring this pivotal chapter in history with us. Until next time, remember, the past is not just a story, it's the foundation of our present.